I am way past facing reality, Franklin. I am done standing by the door waiting for Mama to come home. Now, are you with me, Saint? Or are you with them?
The statement that Cissy made to Franklin at the end of Snowfall Season 6's premiere really did set the tone for the coming season and the direction it's heading in. Money is the root of all evil, and nothing tears a family apart like money, were the words of Franklin saying in Season 5. Ironically, Scully gave a very similar piece of advice to Jerome: make peace with his family because karma is real, something Louie threw on the floor, which was a crane that symbolizes hope and challenging times. Now, Franklin's world came crashing down at the end of Season 5 when Teddy stripped him of the one thing you do not mess with when it comes to Sane: his money. He doesn't play games when it comes to over $70 million, which put him on a warpath that involved murders and stealing cash as well as product from Uncle Jerome and Louie. He took matters into his own hands, and so it was safe to assume tension would be at an all-time high between Jerome, Louie, and Franklin at the beginning of Season 6. So at this moment in time, Franklin still has hopes that there's still a chance to get out the game and ride off into the sunset with Veronique, something he promised at the end of Season 5, and something that gives him an added incentive is his baby. And it does seem like Franklin will do whatever is necessary to not only get back what's his, but to take down Teddy with the help of Ruben. This was something that initially caused a conflict, but Cissy's declaration and true statement put things into perspective. This country doesn't give a shit about Franklin Sane, and nobody was coming to save him. Now, Franklin wasn't the only character who was willing to do what was necessary. So was Uncle Jerome, Aunt Louie, and unfortunately for Black Diamond, she paid the price. Now, when it comes to the game, innocent lives are always in the crossfire, and not just those who get caught up in the game, but those who die also leave behind loved ones, sometimes a wife, kids, and a family. And if you were the sole breadwinner, the world of these kids and families can change in a heartbeat. Similar was the case when Jerome left Black Diamond's son without a mother, and this is the stark reality of Franklin's war and his money. How many more lives is it gonna cost? Now, with the authorities and the legal route unable to help Franklin get his money back, Franklin took matters into his own hands. He found a new cash house after his old one was robbed, and this time he kept it between him and Veronique. This cash house had over $3 million worth of cash and product which belonged to Uncle Jerome and Louie, and at first, Veronique was reluctant to help Franklin. She wanted out. She said there were other ways rather than stealing this money from family. But Franklin wanted to hurt those that hurt him. Jerome and Louie were two, and the other was Teddy. Now, one way to attack someone doesn't have to be an attack on them directly, but rather an attack on their weakness, and everybody in this game has one. You just have to find it. So it seems that Franklin is using any means to get back at Teddy, but most importantly, get his money back. The way in which he was trying to hurt Jerome and Louie was to hurt their organization. He tried to undercut them by selling bricks to Big Dion for $10K, but he didn't want to get in the middle of a family squabble. He was about the bread. Now, Franklin also turned his attentions to Veronique to try and help him clean his money in Miami. He called it survival, and whatever was to happen in the next few weeks would determine the course of the rest of their lives. But that was Franklin's issue. He thinks that he can still control what happens, which to a certain degree you can. But when the CIA are involved, and now the KGB, there are certain things which are out of Franklin's control. He also needs the help of others, and also Veronique, who goes to Miami. A clue that we were given in Season 5 was how Veronique and her mother used to con their way through life, and she was someone who we were first introduced to in Episode 2, something I'll come to later on. On the other side of the phone, and someone who'd been waiting for Franklin's call, was Uncle Jerome, and you could sense the tension at the beginning of this conversation. It was a conversation which started with Franklin using the term Uncle Jerome, and Jerome calling Franklin his nephew, but that's not how the call ended. It was clear that these two were characters who weren't ready to patch things up or clear the air. So we heard Jerome warning him that if he doesn't give back what he stole, then he's gonna show him how it works. But Franklin's response was he can come after him. He came in with his eyes open into the game, and they still are. Now, this conversation revealed a key detail that Louie hadn't told Jerome before. Franklin pulled a gun on her at the end of Season 5, and who knows what he would have done if Buckley wasn't there. So Jerome wasn't just about to sit back and let Franklin control the situation. He turned to Buckley, and even though he was no longer on the payroll of the LAPD, he still had friends on that force. So as Black Diamond and Dallas were done with their exchange with Big Dion, they were pulled over. Now, this seemed to be a setup after Jerome's conversation with Big Dion. He knew that they would be having this exchange at night. And so I really don't think Big Dion was involved, because he did make it clear he was all about making bread, not getting in between this family squabble. But Jerome had one thing in mind: get the information on Franklin's new safe house, and in doing so, he was brutal in the way he beat down Black Diamond. And even though he never got the answer he wanted either from Dallas or Diamond, who's now dead, he did send his nephew a message. He wasn't backing down from this war. Now meanwhile, Teddy was desperate to get back in with the CIA, but before he could do that, he had to clean the mud off his shoes. But he also had the problem of Parisa, who'd gone missing, where at the end of season 5, it seemed like she may have been taken by Ruben, which didn't happen to be the case, but that is something we'll come back to later on. Now, where Louie and Jerome had no drugs to sell, they met with Teddy to get some more product on consignment. And it was only after he found out it was Franklin who stole from them did he agree to give them 300 bricks. Because after all, it was him who robbed Franklin of his 73 million, which caused him to rob Jerome and Louie. Now Gustavo continues to work undercover as a CI, but his paranoia grows as the 2 episodes unfold. And that's because he has a new boss. He was detained by the DEA at the end of season 5, and with Teddy asking him where he was the night before, he gave him a cover-up story of him having to take his kid to the emergency room. Now, lying to Teddy made Gustavo really uncomfortable because he knew that Teddy would check his story, which is why he tried to cover his tracks with Agent Marino, who in turn did tell him that if he does what he's told as a CI, he'd be safe. Now elsewhere, Cissy is determined more than ever to take down Teddy, and she met with Ruben, who told her the next part of the plan was to meet Franklin Saint, and she was fully on board, but first they had to convince Franklin. Now this was another war that Franklin was fighting, and it was a war with himself, and this was something that RV once mentioned in season 5. Some men go from war to war, but others they're at constant war with themselves, and in essence this is what Franklin was feeling at this moment in time. He was struggling when it came to siding with the Russians and hesitant to go against his own country, but that's when Cissy gave him the stark reminder of what happened in Cuba. Teddy took away Alton and did so knowing that Cissy couldn't do a damn thing. So was Franklin with her or with them? Which was the moment where Franklin made his decision. After an explosive start to season 6, the second episode saw Cissy try and mend a broken family. She tried to get Jerome and Franklin on the same page, but what was to unfold would separate them even more. So Franklin had some tough decisions to make as he met with Ruben, and so did Louie and Jerome, who were trying to get back to business after Franklin robbed them. Gustavo recognized Ruben, and we finally got to the bottom of Parisa's mystery disappearance, and that's where episode 2 started. Parisa managed to escape Ruben at the end of season 5. We saw her outrunning Ruben, jumping over fences, but on a landing she was knocked out with an injury to the head. She was then pulled over by the police, and when she was a little resistant, they took her away and locked her up. Teddy does eventually come to her rescue and ask Parisa if she got a good look at the man who was chasing her, and she was able to work with a sketch artist who came up with a drawing that resembled none other than Ruben. So as Franklin arrived at the museum that Cissy took him to when he was a kid, they met with Ruben, where Cissy let the 2 men talk. Ruben wanted to expose the world for the oppression and the lies from the government, but what Franklin wanted was Teddy McDonald. He wanted him delivered to him alive. But first Ruben needed proof that the CIA were importing and selling cocaine. Now Franklin didn't exactly have solid evidence, but he could give him his story.
Could get shit done, but it wasn't until he got me out of jail that I really put it all together. I realized what it was I'd become a part of.
This was a callback to season 1 and how Franklin first met Teddy, information that Ruben took to his boss, but he wanted more. Now, working with the KGB wasn't Franklin's only tough problem that he had to make and face. He had to look Dallas in her eyes after the loss of Black Diamond, who said she was out. They made a promise to each other that if anything happened to the other, then they'd be out the game and look after their kids, and it seemed like her decision was made. Now, Franklin also had to face Kane and come to a decision whether to continue revenge on Uncle Jerome and Louie. But Kane definitely senses some hesitation from Franklin, and he warns him. Either he helps him or he considers Franklin an enemy, but it's understandable that Franklin is a bit hesitant. Regardless of whether he's at war with Uncle Jerome and Aunt Louie, Jerome is still his uncle, but the exchange at the end of the episode may have completely buried any family ties, and that's something I'm going to come back to later on. But as decisions were key for Franklin in episode 2, he had to decide whether to work with Veronique's mother, and this was our first look at Veronique's mother, and a lot was said in season 5 whether we could trust Veronique or not, which is something I still do think is up in the air. Now, Veronique told her mother that she was in trouble, but it wasn't the baby that was in trouble. The baby was a blessing. The trouble was Franklin Saint's money. And when 70 million was mentioned, she gave a very generous tip to the dealer and had her eyes set on a finder's fee for Franklin Saint's money. But Franklin did warn her, the man they were up against was manipulative, smart, trained, and when his back was against the wall, also a killer. Now, Franklin was hesitant to do business with Veronique's mother, but his tone changed when she explained how they would have taken his money from his bank accounts in Panama, which ironically Teddy helped him to set up earlier in the series. And while we're talking about Easter eggs and situations from earlier in the series, this was another. Franklin seen an ice cream van driving down the street, and where he wanted to pay for a kid to go and get some ice cream. The difference this time was, nobody was willing to accept his generosity. Now, Veronique's mother explained that the man that they were up against may be trained and a killer, but the person who helped him most likely wasn't. The man who helped him wouldn't have been in-house, because the CIA would have had to account for the money. She also mentioned there would have been a lot of logistics behind taking the money, including impersonating Franklin, and there aren't many people who can pull off something like this. And after an exchange in negotiation, they settled for a 10% finder's fee, along with her being in Veronique and her grandchild's life. And to be honest, Franklin Saint had no choice but to accept. As Franklin tried to recover what was stolen from him and build from the ground up, Louie and Jerome were also trying to get back to business. They had to convince some of their dealers that they were good for their product and also talk to Scully. And it was a much calmer Scully, by the way, who did give them some words of wisdom, fix things with Kane. But Louie had already connected the dots to who told Kane, Franklin Saint. But Scully did continue to emphasize to make things right with not just Kane, but also Franklin Saint before karma wrecks their life, while he gave them a pair of paper cranes, telling them that he'll be with them in spirit. Now the crane symbolizes hope and healing during challenging times, but as Louie and Jerome leave, the camera does pan to Louie dropping the crane, which may foreshadow how things may be the complete opposite of hope and healing for Louie in her future. Now, before we get to the showdown between Jerome and Franklin, we had the small matter of Gustavo showing Agent Marino the underground tunnel him and Teddy were using to transport their cocaine. But with Teddy continuously paging him, his paranoia went up a level, and even more when he found out Agent Marino hadn't handled the hospital records after he told Teddy in episode 1 that he'd been with his kid in the emergency room when he was picked up by the DEA. So Gustavo was in panic mode because he knows very well how this could end not just for him, but also his family, especially because he knows what Teddy is capable of. But as Teddy meets Gustavo, he shows him a sketch of Ruben, hoping that he knows who he is, and at first glance, he didn't. That was until he sees a picture of him on his fridge from Uncle Louie and Jerome's wedding, but instead of taking this revelation to Teddy, he goes to Franklin first. In another Easter egg and a nod to how they first met, Franklin and Gustavo found themselves at a wrestling match, and that was because it would have been a hard place to bug or hear their conversation. Now Gustavo apologizes for what Teddy did to Franklin, but wanted to know who the man was in the photo. Now, although Franklin wasn't exactly willing to divulge any further information apart from giving him another proposition, get him information on Teddy in exchange for 10 million, and it did seem like they came to an agreement. Now, earlier in the episode, Cissy did try and convince Franklin to mend things with Uncle Jerome.
If I can help open up a door, would you be willing to walk through it?
She also even sat with Jerome over dinner to see how they could bring their family together. And after hearing out his sister, Jerome was open to the idea of talking to Franklin. So during the showdown, Jerome opens up about how he stepped in and became a father figure to Franklin. He even became overwhelmed with emotion with how raising Franklin and seeing him become a man would be the greatest thing in life. But now he looks at him and wonders, how the fuck did he fuck up so bad? He was questioning whether it was his own fault that he'd become so scandalous and cutthroat. In response, Franklin said that Jerome was just a weed dealer and Franklin's vision and business made Jerome. But Jerome said that all he had was blood money, blood on his hands, and the CIA over his head. And as Franklin responded by telling him that he tried to give him his legacy and how he'd been played by a trick that he'd married, Jerome had enough. He slapped him across his face not just once, but twice, which made Franklin Saint stand up and draw his gun, with Jerome demanding, "End this shit right now." But Franklin doesn't pull the trigger. He walks away, and with both men knowing that there's no turning back, both were filled with emotion, pain, guilt, and hurt, as well as revenge.